The crisp, metallic click of the solid gold lighter was the only sound in the cavernous penthouse office. Jackson Hayes, a man who measured his worth in stock tickers and skyline views, didn't even look up from his desk. He simply gestured towards the door, with the lighter, the small flame, dancing like a malevolent spirit. "The prenuptial agreement is ironclad, Charlotte. You get nothing. My lawyers will be in touch about the termination." Outside, the rain began to lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows, mirroring the storm breaking inside her. He was talking about their baby, their unborn child, and he was dismissing them both as if they were a failed business venture. She stood there, one hand protectively on her stomach, her world reduced to the cold, indifferent flick of a rich man's thumb. This is the story of how that one callous gesture would unravel an empire and prove that the most powerful currency in the world isn't money. It's a father's love. Life with Jackson Hayes was a meticulously curated performance. Charlotte Vance had once been captivated by it, by him. They met at a gallery opening where one of her architectural sketches was being displayed, a small local event he'd attended on a whim. He'd been charming electric, with a smile that seemed to mint its own currency. He wasn't old money. He was something more potent in the modern world, new money, self-made, and ferociously ambitious. His tech company Nexus Dynamics had disrupted the financial world, and he moved through life with the predatory grace of a man who had never been told no. Their courtship was a whirlwind of breathtaking excess. Dinners in Paris just for the evening, helicopter rides over the Grand Canyon at sunrise, a private concert with her favorite indie band on their anniversary. He'd showered her with gifts, a vintage Cartier watch, a custom-designed sports car, a wardrobe that cost more than her parents' house. He called her his muse, his anchor in the chaotic world of high-stakes business. Charlotte, an orphan, raised by a quiet, doting father who ran a modest but respected antique bookshop in Vermont, was initially overwhelmed. Her father, Arthur Vance, had been skeptical. "A man who buys that much, Charlotte," he'd said gently over the phone, his voice warm and wise, "is often trying to own something, not love it. Be careful, his price for you isn't your own soul." She had dismissed his concerns as old-fashioned protectiveness. She was in love, or she had convinced herself she was. The penthouse on Park Avenue, with its panoramic views of Central Park, felt like a palace. But over the first 2 years of their marriage, she began to notice the gilding on her cage. Jackson didn't love her passion for architecture. He loved telling people his wife was an architect. He'd funded a small studio for her in the city, but it was more of a showroom for his friends, a testament to his modern sensibilities. When she would get lost in her designs, sketching sustainable community housing projects, he would tap his watch impatiently. "Ellie, darling, the Bainbridges are expecting us. We can't be late. Your hobby can wait." Her friends, the ones from her life before Jackson, slowly faded away. They were too normal, too unambitious for Jackson's circle of venture capitalists and socialites. Her new friends were women with surgically perfected faces and eyes that held the cold, transactional gleam of a stock exchange floor. They didn't discuss books or art. They discussed asset allocation and the best tax havens. The loneliness was a quiet, creeping thing. It found her in the echoing silence of the 10,000-square-foot penthouse when Jackson was on yet another business trip to Singapore or Dubai. She would stand by the vast windows, looking down at the city lights, feeling utterly disconnected from the vibrant life teeming below. Then the miracle happened. A small, fluttering hope that started as a whisper in her soul. After months of trying, she was pregnant. She imagined Jackson's reaction, picturing a crack in his perfect polished veneer. She imagined him dropping to his knees, pressing his ear to her stomach, his voice thick with an emotion that wasn't tied to a stock price or a successful merger. She planned the reveal perfectly. A quiet evening at home, a tiny pair of designer baby shoes in a gift box on his pillow. He came home late, smelling of expensive whiskey and someone else's perfume. He was agitated, pacing the marble floor, barking into his phone about a hostile takeover bid from a rival firm led by the notoriously ruthless Sienna Davenport. "Jackson," she began softly, her heart thumping against her ribs. "Not now, Charlotte," he snapped, not looking at her. "I'm on the verge of the biggest deal of my life. This Davenport woman is a shark. I need total focus." "But this is important," she insisted, holding out the small box. He sighed, an exaggerated theatrical sound of pure annoyance. He snatched the box from her hand and ripped it open. He stared at the tiny white sneakers for a long, silent moment. Charlotte held her breath, waiting for the joy, the surprise, the love. Instead, a chilling coldness crept into his eyes. It was a look she had seen him give a subordinate who had failed him once just before he'd fired him on the spot. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, his voice dangerously low. He tossed the box onto the bed as if it were contaminated. "A baby. Now, do you have any idea what this means?" "It means we're going to be a family," she whispered, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "It means a distraction," he corrected, his voice rising. "It means crying and sleepless nights and a complete derailment of our lives. I'm about to close a 9-figure deal, Charlotte. Our image is one of power, of sleek, unencumbered success. A screaming infant doesn't fit the brand." The cruelty of his words struck her like a physical blow. "The brand Jackson. This is our child." "It's a liability," he spat. "A biological complication. You need to fix this. There are clinics, discreet ones. I'll have my assistant arrange everything." Charlotte stared at him, the man she thought she knew dissolving before her eyes, replaced by a monster clad in a bespoke suit. The love she thought they shared was just another one of his assets, and it was about to be liquidated. The days that followed were a masterclass in psychological warfare. The warmth vanished from their home, replaced by a frigid, oppressive silence. Jackson treated her like a ghost, his eyes sliding past her, as if she were a piece of furniture he no longer liked. The casual touches, the morning kisses, the shared laughter over breakfast, all gone. He moved into one of the guest suites at the far end of the penthouse, the distance a physical manifestation of the chasm that had opened between them. He began to apply pressure, not with overt threats, but with a series of cold, calculated maneuvers. He'd leave brochures for exclusive restorative clinics in Switzerland on her nightstand. He'd talk loudly on the phone with his lawyers in her presence, using phrases like unforeseen domestic complications and protecting primary assets. His business life, however, was thriving on the adrenaline of his battle with Sienna Davenport and her company, Apex Innovations. Sienna was his equal in ambition and his superior in ruthlessness. She was everything Jackson admired, sharp, beautiful in a severe way, and utterly devoid of sentiment. Charlotte saw pictures of them in financial magazines captioned "Titans at War," but their body language at industry events seemed more like that of co-conspirators. One evening, Jackson hosted a dinner party. It was a strategic event meant to court investors and project an image of unshakable confidence. Charlotte, now 6 weeks pregnant, and battling morning sickness, was expected to play her part. She put on a brave face and a stunning emerald gown, the fabric hiding the very slight swell of her stomach. Throughout the dinner, Jackson was performatively attentive, placing a hand on the small of her back, laughing at her comments. But his eyes were cold, and his touch felt like ice. The guest of honor was Sienna Davenport herself. It was a bold power move on Jackson's part, inviting his chief rival into his home. Sienna was magnetic. She commanded the room with her sharp intellect and even sharper wit. She engaged Charlotte in conversation, her gaze analytical, missing nothing. "Jackson tells me you're an architect," Sienna said, swirling a glass of red wine. "That must be quaint, designing little houses while he designs the future of global finance." "I focus on sustainable community projects," Charlotte replied, her voice steady. "I believe a home should be more than an asset." Sienna smiled, a thin, predatory curve of her lips. "A noble sentiment. But sentiment doesn't fund progress or win wars." She looked from Charlotte's flat stomach pointedly up to her eyes, a silent, knowing challenge. In that moment, Charlotte knew that Sienna was not just a business rival. She was the future Jackson wanted, a future without the complication Charlotte was carrying. After the guests had left, the facade shattered. "You were staring at her all night," Charlotte said, the accusation hanging in the air. "I was studying my competition," Jackson retorted, loosening his tie. "Something you wouldn't understand. Sienna gets it. She understands that sacrifice is necessary for greatness." "And our baby is the sacrifice?" Charlotte's voice trembled. Jackson's face hardened into a mask of cruel resolve. "I spoke to my team. The optics are a disaster. A pregnancy right now suggests a shift in focus domesticity. It suggests weakness. Davenport will use it against me. The board will get nervous. This isn't about the board, Jackson. This is about us. There is no us if my company falters," he roared, his voice bouncing off the marble and glass. "Everything you have, this apartment, your clothes, your fake studio. It's all because of me. Because of my relentless, undivided focus. You are threatening that." He walked over to the bar and poured himself a stiff scotch. He took a long swallow before turning back to her, his eyes devoid of any emotion she recognized. "So I'm giving you a choice, Charlotte," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "It's the life we have, the future I am building, or that thing you are carrying. You make an appointment, and we go back to how things were. Or you can walk out that door with nothing but the clothes on your back. The prenup is absolute. I've made sure of it." Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. It wasn't a choice. It was an execution order. He was asking her to choose between a life of empty luxury and the life of her own child. She looked at this man, this stranger, and the last vestiges of love and hope withered and died. In their place, a cold, hard certainty began to grow. She finally understood her father's warning. Jackson hadn't just bought her things. He had tried to buy her very being, and the price was indeed her soul. Her hand went to her stomach, a primitive, protective gesture. She felt a surge of strength she didn't know she possessed. It was the fierce, unyielding power of a mother. "There's nothing to choose," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the tense silence. "I'm keeping my baby." Jackson's face twisted into a sneer of disbelief, then contempt. "Fine," he hissed. "You've made your decision. Don't expect a single penny from me. You're a fool, Charlotte. You're throwing away a kingdom for a crying, pathetic infant." He turned his back on her, dismissing her, already moving on. For him, The transaction was complete. The asset had been written off. Jackson didn't wait. His cruelty was as efficient as his business dealings. The very next morning, while Charlotte was numbly packing a small suitcase with a few personal items, photos of her and her father, her favorite books, her portfolio of architectural sketches, two stern-faced men in dark suits appeared at the bedroom door, Jackson's personal security. "Ma'am," the taller one said, his voice polite but firm. "Mr. Hayes has instructed us to escort you from the premises." The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread from her chest to her cheeks. She was being evicted from her own home like a common trespasser. She looked past them down the long, opulent hallway and saw Jackson standing by the elevator phone to his ear, already deep in a business call. He didn't even grant her a final glance. She was walked out of the building. The doorman who had greeted her with a warm smile every day for 2 years, now staring fixedly at a point above her head, his face a mask of professional indifference. Jackson had already cut her out of the narrative of his life, editing her existence with a few swift, brutal commands. Standing on the rain-slicked pavement of Park Avenue, with a single suitcase and the designer clothes on her back, the reality of her situation crashed down on her. She reached into her purse for her phone to call a cab, then pulled out her wallet, her credit cards. The platinum cards Jackson had so proudly given her were gone. She remembered leaving her purse on the kitchen counter that morning. He must have had his staff remove them. She tried her debit card at a nearby ATM. "Card blocked. Please contact your bank." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her shock. He had locked her out of their joint account. She was pregnant, alone, and utterly penniless in the most expensive city in the world. She swallowed her pride, the bitter taste of it filling her mouth, and called the one person she knew she could count on her oldest friend, Maria. Maria was a nurse who lived in a tiny one-bedroom apartment in Queens, a world away from the gilded prison Charlotte had just fled. Hearing Maria's warm, concerned voice on the other end of the line was the first kindness Charlotte had felt in months, and it broke her. The story tumbled out between choked sobs, a torrent of pain, betrayal, and fear. "You get in a taxi right now," Maria said, her voice fierce with protective anger. "I don't care what it costs, I'll pay for it when you get here. Just come home. Charlotte, come to me." The following weeks were a blur of survival. Maria's small apartment was a haven of warmth and normalcy. The smell of coffee brewing in the morning, the sound of sitcoms on the television, the comfortable clutter of a life well lived. It was all a stark contrast to the sterile, silent luxury of the penthouse. Charlotte learned the humbling reality of having nothing. She sold the Cartier watch and the few pieces of jewelry she'd had in her suitcase. The money was a lifeline, but it wouldn't last forever. She started looking for work, but being in the early, exhausting stages of pregnancy made it difficult. No architectural firm wanted to hire a new junior designer who would need maternity leave in 6 months. The shame was a constant companion. She had been so proud, so sure of the life she was building. Now she felt like a failure. She spent her days walking through the parks in Queens, her portfolio in her bag, feeling more invisible than she ever had in Jackson's shadow. The world saw a woman who had failed to hold on to her millionaire husband. They didn't see the woman who had chosen her child over a fortune. One evening, staring at her dwindling bank balance, the stark reality of bringing a child into this instability hit her with full force. She couldn't rely on Maria's generosity forever. She needed help, real help. There was only one person left to call, The person she had been avoiding, not out of fear, but out of a deep, painful shame for not heeding his advice. Her father. She had told him a diluted version of the truth, that she and Jackson were separating, that she needed some time. She had downplayed the cruelty, the abandonment, the utter destitution. She hadn't wanted to worry him. Arthur Vance was in his late 60s, and she pictured him in his cozy bookshop in Vermont, surrounded by the quiet dignity of old leather and paper, and she couldn't bear the thought of shattering his peace with the ugly truth of her life. But now she had no choice. For her baby, she had to swallow her pride. With trembling fingers, she dialed his number. He answered on the second ring, his voice as calm and comforting as she remembered. "Charlotte Pumpkin, is everything all right? You sound tired." And just like that, her carefully constructed dam of composure broke. The whole story poured out of her, the pregnancy, the ultimatum, the public eviction, the frozen bank accounts, the terrifying uncertainty of her future. She cried deep, gut-wrenching sobs of a daughter who had finally come home, if only by phone. She expected him to be angry, to shout, to say, "I told you so." Instead, he listened patiently, the silence on his end of the line, profound and heavy. When she finally finished her voice, a raw whisper, there was a long pause. "Is that his full name?" Arthur asked, his voice different now. It was unnervingly calm, stripped of all warmth, and replaced by something that sounded like polished steel. "Jackson Hayes, CEO of Nexus Dynamics." "Yes, Daddy," she whispered, "and he is based in New York." "The company is publicly traded on the NASDAQ." "Yes. Why?" Another pause, this one shorter, more decisive. "Don't you worry about a thing, my dear," Arthur Vance said, and the quiet authority in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. "Not the money, not your apartment, not that boy. I want you to rest. I want you to eat well and take care of my grandchild. I will handle Jackson Hayes." "Daddy, what are you going to do?" she asked, a flicker of fear mixing with her relief. "Please don't do anything crazy." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that was completely alien to her. "Crazy? Oh no, Charlotte. I'm going to be perfectly, devastatingly rational. He has made the grave mistake of valuing assets above my daughter. I'm simply going to teach him a lesson in valuation." He hung up, leaving Charlotte staring at her phone, a sense of awe and trepidation washing over her. She had just unleashed something. She had called her quiet, gentle, book-loving father. But the man who had answered at the end of that call was someone else entirely. For Jackson Hayes, the day his world began to fracture started like any other, with a 5 a.m. workout with his personal trainer, a custom-blended kale smoothie, and a market analysis report that put Nexus Dynamics on a trajectory for another record-breaking quarter. He had successfully excised Charlotte from his life with surgical precision. The momentary inconvenience was over. Now he could focus entirely on the acquisition of a smaller, innovative AI firm, a move that would cement his dominance over Sienna Davenport. He felt powerful, unburdened. He strode into the Nexus Dynamics Tower, a gleaming monument of steel and glass in the heart of Manhattan, feeling the familiar rush of being a master of his universe. The first sign of trouble was insignificant, almost laughable. He was at a power lunch with 2 hedge fund managers trying to woo them into backing his next venture. When the bill came a staggering sum he wouldn't even blink at, he handed the waiter his exclusive black-tiered Centurion card. The waiter returned a few minutes later, his expression apologetic. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Hayes. The card has been declined." Jackson frowned. "That's impossible. Run it again." The waiter nodded and left, only to return with the same result. Declined, sir. The message says, card suspended. Contact issuer. A flicker of annoyance. He pulled out a second card, a corporate platinum. That too was declined. Red-faced, he had to ask one of the fund managers to cover the bill, a deep humiliation that soured the entire meeting. He chalked it up to a glitch, a technical error in the bank's fraud detection system. Back in his office, he called his private banker at Sterling Wentworth, a man whose entire job was to cater to his every financial whim. "Robert, what the hell is going on with my cards?" Jackson barked into the phone. Robert sounded flustered, confused. I don't know, Mr. Hayes. I'm looking at your accounts right now, and this is very strange. There's a freeze, a complete administrative lockdown on all your personal assets held by this institution." "A freeze on whose authority?" Jackson demanded, his voice rising. "That's just it, sir. I've never seen anything like it. It's not from a government agency like the IRS or the SEC. It appears to be an internal directive from our highest-level global risk management division, citing unforeseen third-party liabilities. It's completely locked. I can't touch it." A cold knot of dread began to form in Jackson's stomach. This was more than a glitch. He ended the call and tried to log into his personal trading account with a different brokerage. Access denied. He tried to wire money from his corporate account to a personal one. Transaction failed. It was as if a digital wall had been erected around his entire fortune, and he was on the outside looking in. Panic began its insidious creep. His wealth was his identity, his power, his very lifeblood. Without it, he was nothing. He spent the afternoon in a frantic series of calls to his lawyers, his accountants, his board members. No one had an answer. They were all hitting the same impenetrable wall. Whispers started circulating. His CFO called his voice tense. Their main line of corporate credit had been suspended pending a review. The AI acquisition was now in jeopardy. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across his opulent office, his private unlisted phone line rang. The caller ID was blocked. He snatched it up. "Who is this?" he snarrows. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, and carried a weight of immense, unshakable authority. It was the voice of a man who had never had to raise it in his life. "Mr. Hayes, my name is Arthur Vance." Jackson's mind raced. Vance? Charlotte's father. The old man with the dusty bookshop in Vermont. What could he possibly want? Was he calling to plead for his daughter? "Look, if this is about Charlotte, you're wasting your time." Jackson sneered, feeling a surge of arrogant confidence. "She made her choice. The little money you think you can get from me is, let me stop you there, son." Arthur's voice cut through him, the word son dripping with icy condescension. "I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding about who I am. You see, the bookshop is a hobby, a pleasant diversion. It keeps me grounded." A confused silence hung in the air. "My actual work," Arthur continued, his voice as smooth and cold as river stone, "is as the chairman and majority shareholder of Vance Global Holdings." Jackson felt the blood drain from his face. Vance Global. Not a company, but a colossus. A private multinational conglomerate with controlling interests in logistics, banking, and technology across 4 continents. They were a silent giant, rarely in the news because they owned the news outlets. Their influence was the stuff of legend in the highest circles of finance, a force that could move markets with a single, quiet phone call. Sterling Wentworth Jackson's primary bank was one of their smaller subsidiaries. Vance Global Arthur said, as if sensing Jackson's shock has a very strict ethical charter. We do not abide partners who demonstrate a profound character deficit. Your treatment of my daughter Charlotte, who I should mention is the sole heir to my entire portfolio, constitutes such a deficit. Jackson was speechless, his throat suddenly tight and dry. The room felt like it was tilting. The assets you believe are yours, Mr. Hayes, Arthur explained patiently, as if to a child, are all leveraged through institutions that fall under the Vance Global umbrella. Your credit lines, your investment platforms, the very bank that holds your company's capital. They are all in a manner of speaking mine, and as of this morning I have instructed them to place a temporary but total hold on any account associated with you or Nexus Dynamics. You can't do that, Jackson stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. That's illegal. Arthur Vance laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was the sound of a lion observing a mouse. Illegal, Mr. Hayes, when you control the board of the bank that lends you the money. It's called risk mitigation. You, my boy, have suddenly become the highest possible risk. You mistook my daughter for a liability. You are about to learn the meaning of the word. The line went dead. Jackson Hayes stood in the center of his office, the useless phone in his hand, surrounded by the trappings of a fortune he no longer controlled. He was a king in a kingdom that had just been seized by a power he never even knew existed. The bookkeeper from Vermont had just frozen his entire world with a single phone call. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Jackson Hayes, the financial wunderkind, the untouchable titan of tech, became a man trapped in a prison of his own wealth. He was a multi-millionaire on paper, but he couldn't afford to buy a cup of coffee. The first 24 hours were a blur of rage and denial. He stormed into the Sterling Wentworth headquarters the next morning, demanding to see the bank president, a man he had golfed with just last month. He was stopped by security in the lobby. A junior vice president was sent down to meet him, a nervous young man who couldn't meet his eye. Mr. Hayes, I'm sorry, but your accounts are under an executive review, the man mumbled, sweating under Jackson's glare. There's nothing we can do at this branch level. Executive review, I am an executive client, Jackson roared, causing heads to turn in the marble-floored lobby. My company has over $100 million in assets with you. Yes, sir, the man said, flinching. And for now, that's where they'll stay. Humiliated, he retreated. He called an emergency board meeting at Nexus Dynamics. He tried to project calm, to spin the situation as a temporary liquidity issue, a hostile, short-seller attack. But the board members were sharks. They could smell blood in the water. News of their primary credit line being frozen had already spread. The stock price for Nexus Dynamics had begun to wobble. The AI acquisition, the deal that was meant to be his crowning achievement, was the first major casualty. The smaller firm's CEO called him personally. Jackson, he said, his voice flat. We're invoking the financing contingency clause. Your funding is no longer secure. We're pulling out of the deal. We've had another offer. Another offer from who? Jackson demanded. Apex Innovations. Sienna Davenport. Her funding is ironclad. The betrayal was a sharp physical pain. Sienna. Of course. She hadn't hesitated to move in for the kill. He tried calling her a desperate, humbling act. She took the call, her voice oozing mock sympathy. Jackson, darling, I heard you're having some cash flow problems, she purred. Such a shame. If you'd gotten rid of your little domestic distraction sooner, perhaps you would have been more focused. She hung up. His world began to shrink with terrifying speed. His corporate expense account was shut down. The lease on his company's fleet of luxury cars was suspended. He had to take a yellow cab home from the office, a mortifying experience he hadn't had in a decade. When he arrived at his penthouse, the concierge stopped him. "Mr. Hayes, I'm sorry. There's an issue with the building fees. The automatic payment was declined." He was locked out of his own home, forced to spend the night in a mid-range hotel paying with the last few $100s of cash he had in his wallet. The stark, impersonal room with its scratchy blankets and faint smell of disinfectant was a brutal mockery of his former life. Desperation began to gnaw at him. His friends, the ones who had clapped him on the back at exclusive clubs and eagerly accepted his invitations to yacht parties, were suddenly unavailable. Calls went to voicemail. Texts were left unread. In the world he inhabited, financial trouble was a contagious disease, and no one wanted to be near the infected. Stripped of his money, he was also stripped of his power, his charm, his very identity. He looked at his reflection in the cheap hotel mirror. The bespoke suit was wrinkled. His face was pale, his eyes witful with a fear he had never known. He was no longer Jackson Hayes, the master of the universe. He was just a man who had made a terrible, terrible mistake. His thoughts turned to Charlotte, not with remorse, not with love, but with a raw, animalistic need for survival. She was the key. Her father had done this to him. She could make him stop. He had to find her. He had to convince her, manipulate her, beg her if he had to. He would promise her anything, marriage, the baby, a world of luxury, anything to get his life back. He hired a cheap private investigator with his last bit of cash. Finding her was surprisingly easy. The investigator traced her to a small, unassuming apartment building in Queens, registered under the name Maria Sanchez. Jackson drove there in a rental car, a nondescript sedan that felt alien to him. The neighborhood was a vibrant tapestry of cultures, smells, and sounds he had only ever witnessed from the tinted windows of a chauffeured town car. It felt like a foreign country. He stood on the pavement outside her building, a 3-story brick walk-up. It was so normal, so beneath him. He buzzed the apartment, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and contempt. He would fix this. He would turn on the charm, the charisma that had won her over in the first place. He would get his kingdom back. The door buzzed open. The climb up the 3 flights of stairs felt like an ascent into another world. The hallway smelled of garlic and cleaning products, a stark contrast to the custom-scented, climate-controlled corridors of his penthouse. He found apartment 3B and knocked, smoothing his now rumpled suit jacket, trying to compose his features into a mask of sincere regret. The door opened, and there she was. Charlotte looked different. She wasn't wearing designer silks or glittering diamonds. She was in a simple cotton maternity dress. Her hair was tied back in a loose bun, and her feet were bare. But it was her face that struck him. The anxiety and sadness that had clouded her features for months were gone. In their place was a calm serenity, a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her. She looked healthier, more vibrant than he had seen her in years. Her pregnancy was more pronounced now, a gentle, undeniable curve to her belly. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw him, but there was no fear, no flicker of the old adoration. There was only a cool, appraising stillness. "Jackson," she said, her voice even. "What are you doing here?" "Charlotte, thank God I found you." He began, forcing a pained expression onto his face. He tried to step inside, but she didn't move, blocking the doorway. We need to talk. I've made a terrible mistake. A catastrophic mistake." "You made a choice," she corrected him, her voice devoid of emotion. "Now why are you here?" His practiced charm faltered in the face of her composure. He decided to switch tactics to desperation. "Your father, Charlotte. He's destroying me. He's frozen everything. My accounts, my company, everything is gone. I'm ruined." "My father is protecting his family," she said simply, "something you failed to understand." "This isn't protection, it's a nuclear attack," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Please, you have to call him. Tell him to stop. I'll do anything. I mean it. We can be a family. You me the baby. I want that. I see it now. I was just stressed. The deal with Sienna, the pressure. It wasn't me." He reached out to touch her arm, but she recoiled as if from a snake. "Don't," she said, her voice dropping a new edge of steel in it. "Don't you dare touch me." The rejection stunned him. This was not the pliable, gentle Charlotte he knew. "You don't want our baby Jackson." She continued, her gaze unwavering. "You want a solution to your problem. You see me as a key, a tool to get your money back. Just like you saw our child as a liability. You haven't changed. You're just desperate." He stared at her, seeing the truth in her words reflected in her clear, honest eyes. She saw right through him, through the lies and the performance, to the hollow, grasping core of the man he was. "I loved you," he whispered, a last-ditch attempt at emotional blackmail. Charlotte laughed, a short, bitter sound. "No, you didn't. You loved the idea of me. The quiet, artistic wife who looked good on your arm at galas. The woman who wouldn't challenge you. The moment I became a real person with a real non-negotiable need, the need to protect my child, I became inconvenient. And you discard inconvenient things, Jackson." From inside the apartment, Maria appeared behind Charlotte. Her arms crossed, her expression one of pure fury. "You heard her," Maria said. "Get lost." Jackson looked from Charlotte's resolute face to Maria's protective stance. The game was over. There was no angle left to play. He had no leverage, no power, nothing. He saw his reflection in the window of the apartment door, a desperate, broken man in a cheapening suit. And in that moment, he finally understood. Arthur Vance hadn't just taken his money. He had taken his reflection, his identity, and shown him the ugly, empty reality that lay beneath. "You'll regret this," he snarled, the desperation curdling into venom. "Both of you." Charlotte simply looked at him with something akin to pity. "No, Jackson," she said softly. "You're the one who will be living with regret. I'm living with my child. I chose life. You chose money. And it seems you've lost." She closed the door in his face. The soft click of the lock echoed in the hallway, a final, definitive sound. It was the end, not just of their marriage, but of the entire world he had built. He was left alone in the hallway, with nothing but the smell of garlic and the crushing weight of his own choices. Jackson Hayes's fall was as swift and brutal as his rise had been meteoric. Without access to capital nexus dynamics, collapsed like a house of cards. The board, seeing the writing on the wall, forced him out. In a final act of humiliation, the company's remaining assets were acquired for pennies on the dollar by Apex Innovations. A press release announced Sienna Davenport as the new CEO of the merged entity, praising her for her strategic vision and financial stability. Jackson's name was not mentioned. He was forced into personal bankruptcy. The penthouse, The cars, the watches, the art collection, all were seized and liquidated to pay off a fraction of his debts. The fair-weather friends, the business associates, the entire ecosystem that had orbited his wealth vanished as if they had never existed. He was a pariah. The financial news outlets that had once celebrated his genius now wrote scathing articles about his hubris and mysterious sudden collapse. He ended up in a small rented room in a run-down part of the city, the kind of place he wouldn't have driven through before. He took a job in sales for a small, struggling software company, cold calling potential clients. He wore off-the-rack suits and ate his lunch from a paper bag. Every day was a grinding reminder of what he had lost. He would sometimes see Charlotte's name in the society pages, not as a socialite, but in features on emerging architectural talent. Each mention was a fresh twist of the knife. He was haunted not by the loss of his fortune, but by the memory of her quiet strength as she closed the door on him, and the dawning realization that he had thrown away the only thing of genuine value he had ever possessed. For Charlotte, the months after Jackson's visit were a time of quiet blossoming. With her father's backing, she was free from financial worry. But she refused to step back into a life of idle luxury. Arthur, true to his word, had handled everything. He never gloated or said, "I told you so." He simply provided the security she needed to build a life on her own terms. She moved out of Maria's apartment and into a beautiful light-filled brownstone in Brooklyn, one with a garden in the back. She poured her energy into her work, opening a small, independent architectural firm, Vance Design Studios. She focused on what she was passionate about: creating beautiful, affordable, and sustainable homes for families. Her designs were innovative and empathetic, and she quickly gained a reputation for her integrity and vision. 5 months later, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Arthur. Holding her son for the first time, his tiny fingers wrapped around hers, Charlotte felt a profound sense of peace. All the pain and betrayal she had endured had led her to this perfect, sacred moment. The love she felt for this tiny human was more real, more powerful than any fleeting thrill Jackson's world had ever offered. Her father was a doting grandfather. The reclusive titan of Vance Global was completely undone by his grandson, spending hours simply holding him, his face softened with a love that was pure and unconditional. He would visit her studio not as a powerful chairman, but as a proud father looking at her blueprints with genuine admiration. "You're building a real legacy, Charlotte," he told her one afternoon as baby Arthur slept in his carrier nearby. "Not one of glass and steel that can crumble overnight, but one of brick and heart and family. That's the kind that lasts." Charlotte looked around her studio at the plans for a new community center on her desk, at her beautiful son sleeping peacefully, and she knew he was right. She had been trapped in a gilded cage, believing it was a palace. It took losing everything to realize she had the power to build her own kingdom, one founded not on a cold balance sheet, but on the unshakable foundations of love, resilience, and self-worth. Jackson Hayes had abandoned her, but in doing so, he had set her free. 5 years had passed. 5 years of peace growth and the quiet, joyful rhythms of a life rebuilt. The ghost of Jackson Hayes had long since faded from Charlotte's daily thoughts, relegated to a sad, cautionary chapter in a book she no longer read. Her world was now colored in the vibrant hues of her son's laughter and the satisfying blues of architectural drafts. Arthur Vance Jr., or Ari, as everyone called him, was a whirlwind of joyous energy. At 5 years old, He had his mother's kind eyes and his grandfather's thoughtful curiosity. He was the sun around which Charlotte's universe lovingly orbited. Her firm Vance Design Studios had become a celebrated name in the industry, lauded for its commitment to creating spaces that nurtured communities. She was no longer Jackson Hayes' discarded wife. She was Charlotte Vance, a creator, a mother, a woman whole and happy on her own terms. It was a crisp autumn afternoon in Central Park. The leaves were a riot of gold and crimson, and the air was filled with the scent of roasted chestnuts. Charlotte was pushing Ari on a swing, his delighted squeals soaring into the bright blue sky. It was a moment of perfect, uncomplicated happiness. That's when she felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the primitive instinct of being watched. She slowed the swing, her eyes scanning the periphery of the playground. Her gaze landed on a figure standing near an old oak tree, partially obscured by its trunk. A man thin and hunched, wearing a threadbare jacket that was no match for the autumn chill. Even from a distance, even with the years and the hardship etched into his frame, she knew him. It was Jackson. The sight of him sent a jolt of ice through her veins. Her first immediate instinct was a fierce primal wave of protection. She swiftly lifted Ari from the swing, holding him close, her body a physical shield between her son and the ghost from the past. Ari, sensing the sudden tension in his mother, looked up at her with a concerned frown. Jackson took a hesitant step forward, then another. He looked like a stray dog, starved and uncertain, expecting to be kicked. The arrogant swagger that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a shuffling, defeated gait. His face was gaunt. His once perfect hair was thinning and unkempt, and his eyes, those once predatory eyes that held the cold gleam of the stock market, were now hollowed out, filled with a profound, soul-deep weariness. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Charlotte," he said. His voice was a hoarse rasp, as if it hadn't been used for years. "What do you want, Jackson?" she asked, her tone flat and cold. She held Ari's hand tightly, ready to scoop him up and run. "I don't want anything," he said, quickly raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Not money, not anything from you. I know I don't have the right." He looked past her, his gaze falling on Ari, who was peeking out from behind his mother's legs. A look of such raw, agonizing pain crossed Jackson's face that Charlotte almost flinched. It was the look of a man seeing the vibrant, breathing embodiment of his life's greatest mistake. I had to see him," Jackson whispered, his eyes welling up. "Just once. I work as a custodian in a building a few blocks from here. I saw you walking this way. I just wanted to see his face." Charlotte's mind was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. The anger was still there, a hot ember that would never fully extinguish. This man had tried to erase her son from existence. He had called him a complication and a liability. But seeing him now so thoroughly broken, stripped of all artifice and power, the anger was tempered by a sliver of something else. Not pity, but a stark recognition of his profound and utter ruin. "He's beautiful." Jackson choked out a single tear, tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "He looks happy." "He is happy," Charlotte said, her voice firm. "He has a grandfather who adores him. He has friends. He is loved and he is safe. No thanks to you." The words hit him like a physical blow. He nodded, accepting the truth of them without argument. "I know. I deserve this. All of it. I was a monster." He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a small, clumsily wrapped object. It looked like a cheap toy car from a corner store. I bought this for him, for his birthday. I know it's not for a few months. Can you just give it to him? You don't have to say who it's from. This was the moment of decision. Part of her wanted to scream at him, to tell him to take his pathetic gift and disappear forever. How dare he try to insert himself, even in this small, pitiful way, into the perfect world she had fought so hard to build. But then she looked at Ari, whose wide, innocent eyes were fixed on the broken man. One day her son would ask about his father. He would be curious. What would she tell him? That his father was a monster who tried to destroy them. Yes, that was true. But what would Ari see when he looked at his own reflection? Would he see a piece of that monster in himself? She couldn't give him that burden. With a deep breath, Charlotte made a choice. It was not for Jackson. It was for Ari. No, Jackson, she said, her voice softening just a fraction. You can't buy your way back, not even with a small toy. His face fell, his last hope crumbling. But, she continued, her voice regaining its strength, one day he is going to ask me about you. And I want to be able to tell him that his biological father, the man who made a terrible mistake, finally learned what it meant to be a decent human being. She stepped forward, keeping Ari slightly behind her. I don't want your gifts, and you are not going to be a part of his life. Not now. Maybe not ever. But if there is any sliver of a chance, it starts with you. Fix yourself, not your finances. You. Get a real job. Find some stability. Learn what integrity is. Become a man your son wouldn't be ashamed of. She pulled a card from her wallet. It was for a charitable foundation run by Vance Global that specialized in job training and placement for people trying to rebuild their lives. This is not a handout, she said, holding it out to him. It's a door. What you do when you walk through it is up to you. That is the only thing I will ever give you. He stared at the card, as if it were a lifeline. With a trembling hand, he took it. Thank you. He whispered the words, barely audible. Don't thank me, Charlotte said, her gaze like steel. Earn it. Without another word, she took Ari's hand and turned her back on Jackson Hayes. She walked away without looking back, leaving him standing alone under the golden leaves of the oak tree, clutching a tiny card that represented not forgiveness, but a final, unexpected chance at redemption. This story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't measured by the size of your bank account, but by the courage in your heart. Charlotte faced the ultimate betrayal, but found her power not in revenge, but in choosing a new beginning for herself and her child. She proved that integrity and love are assets that can never be frozen or liquidated. If her journey of resilience and the quiet, devastating power of a father's love resonated with you, please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it, and share this video with someone who needs to hear a story of strength and justice. Most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you don't miss our next real-life drama. Your support helps us continue to bring these compelling stories to you. Thank you for listening. What happens when a fairy tale wedding turns into a battlefield? Picture this, a magnificent Hamptons estate. A billionaire, groom on the verge of securing his dynasty, and a beautiful bride from one of New York's most powerful families. The scene is perfect, a meticulously crafted illusion of happiness. But an illusion is all it is. in a moment that will go down in society legend. The cathedral doors swing open, revealing a second woman, also in a wedding dress. She is the ghost of his past, an ex-girlfriend he brutally discarded and legally banned from this very event. She isn't here to object. She's here to detonate a secret that will prove that the groom's entire empire is built on a devastating lie. Stay with me as we unravel the story of Julian Croft and the day his carefully constructed world came crashing down in the most spectacular way possible. The late June sun was a paid actor. It streamed through the stained glass windows of the St. Ignatius Chapel in the Hamptons, bathing the assembled guests in a holy golden light that felt both sanctifying and fantastically expensive. Every detail of the wedding of Julian Croft to Charlotte Van Doren had been curated with the precision of a military campaign. The flowers alone cascading waterfalls of peonies and Dutch hydrangeas cost more than the average American's annual salary. The guest list was a constellation of East Coast power, old money scions, tech titans, senators, and the kind of tastemakers whose approval could mint a brand overnight. Julian Croft stood at the altar, a man sculpted by ambition. His Tom Ford tuxedo was flawless, his posture impeccable. But a thin sheen of sweat glistened on his brow, a lone crack in the marble facade. He was 34 years old and on the precipice of achieving everything he had ever wanted. Croft Innovations, his AI logistics company, had made him a billionaire. Today, marrying Charlotte, he wasn't just gaining a wife, he was acquiring a legacy. The Van Dorens were old New York, their name etched onto museum wings and university libraries. They were the one thing his new money couldn't buy pedigree. His best man and younger brother Damien adjusted Julian's bow tie with a nervous energy that mirrored his own. "Breathe, man." Damien whispered, his voice a low rumble. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad, not your bride." Julian forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Just want everything to be perfect. But it wasn't perfection he was worried about. It was imperfection. Specifically, one very particular 5'7" imperfection, named Ava Reynolds. 2 weeks ago, he had sat in a sterile conference room with his head of security, a former Mossad agent named Gavriel. She is not to get within a 5-mile radius of the venue. Julian had said, his voice as cold and hard as polished steel. He'd slid a photograph across the table. It was a candid shot of Ava laughing, her head thrown back, her brown hair catching the light. It was taken during a time he had worked very hard to forget. Her name is Ava Reynolds. She may try to use an alias. She may try to come as a guest of a guest. I don't care if she's disguised as a nun. You stop her. Am I clear? Crystal. Gavriel had replied, not even glancing at the photo. Consider her a non-entity. But Ava had never felt like a non-entity. She felt like a phantom limb, an ache that returned in the dead of night. She was the ghost of Orchard Street, the 2-bedroom walk-up where they had built his empire on a second-hand laptop and take-out containers of cheap noodles. She was the inconvenient truth he had tried to bury under a mountain of cash and a non-disclosure agreement thick enough to stop a bullet. His gaze flickered towards the front pew where his future mother-in-law, Victoria Van Doren, sat like a reigning monarch. Her silver dress was understated and bespoke her posture and advertisement for generations of inherited superiority. Her eyes, the same piercing blue as her daughter's, met his for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a look of welcome, but of assessment. She was the gatekeeper, and he knew with chilling certainty that his acceptance was conditional. Victoria didn't approve of him. She approved of his balance sheet. The Van Doren fortune, while respectable, had dwindled. They needed a capital infusion, and Julian was it provided he was as advertised, brilliant, successful, and above all, clean. No scandals, no skeletons. The string quartet, tucked away in a loft, swelled into the opening notes of Wagner's bridal chorus. The low hum of chatter among the guests died instantly. A collective sigh of anticipation rippled through the chapel. The massive oak doors at the back of the aisle swung open. And there she was. Charlotte. She was breathtaking, a vision in custom. Vera Wang, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon from which a diamond-encrusted veil cascaded down her back. Her father, a portly man with a kind but worried face, had her arm tucked in his. As she began her slow, regal procession down the aisle, a genuine smile finally broke across Julian's face. He saw his future walking towards him. The summer home in Nantucket, the penthouse on Park Avenue, the children with their mother's eyes and his ambition. The cover of Forbes, the whispers of respect when he entered a room. Everything he had clawed his way up from poverty to attain. He looked at Charlotte, and for that single fleeting moment, he allowed himself to believe the story he had told everyone, including himself. The anxiety receded, replaced by a wave of triumph. He was safe. The ghost had been exorcised. The gilded cage was finally his. Ava Reynolds did not look like a ghost. Ghosts are ethereal, translucent. In the back of a black SUV parked a block away from St. Ignatius, she looked painfully, terrifyingly solid. The wedding dress she wore was not a grand confection like Charlotte's would be. It was a simple, elegant sheath of ivory silk she'd bought at a vintage store years ago, back when a future with Julian had seemed not only possible, but inevitable. It was the dress she would have worn. Putting it on this morning had felt like an act of both sacred remembrance and profound sacrilege. Her best friend Ben Carter sat beside her, his hand gripping hers. His knuckles were white. "Last chance to back out, Ava," he said, his voice gentle. "We can drive to Montauk, get drunk on the beach, and throw rocks at the ocean. No one would blame you." Ava shook her head, her gaze fixed on the chapel spire visible over the treetops. "If I back out now, he wins. He erases me completely." Her mind drifted back, not to the ugly end, but to the brilliant beginning. They had met at a dingy tech incubator in a shared workspace in downtown Manhattan. He was the charismatic visionary with a head full of disruptive ideas. She was the quiet, brilliant coder who saw the structural flaws in his grand designs and knew instinctively how to fix them. They were fat and gasoline. For 3 years, their lives had been a blur of caffeine code and a love so intense it felt like it could power the city. Their apartment on Orchard Street was their entire world. The office was a corner of the living room, where 2 desks were pushed together, their monitors practically touching. Croft Innovations wasn't born in a boardroom. It was born over greasy pizza at 3 a.m., its foundational algorithms written by Ava on a whiteboard, while Julian paced and dreamed out loud. The name itself had been her idea. "It's your name," she'd said. "You're the face. I'm happy to be the engine." That was her mistake. She trusted him. She believed that their love was the only contract they needed. The shift was gradual, then brutally swift. The first round of venture capital changed him. He traded his worn jeans for tailored suits. He started talking about optics and personal branding. He moved their offices to a sleek, impersonal space in the financial district, and suddenly the engine was hidden away in the basement. The breakup happened on a Tuesday. He came back to the Orchard Street apartment, which he hadn't slept in for weeks, and told her it was over. He was clinical detached, like a surgeon removing a tumor. "I'm moving in a different direction," he'd said, avoiding her eyes. "Personally and professionally." "What does that mean?" She'd asked, her heart a cold stone in her chest. "It means the company needs a different kind of public face. We're courting a different class of investor. You and we're not the right story anymore." The right story turned out to be Charlotte Van Doren, whom he'd met at a charity gala 2 months prior. The betrayal of his heart was devastating, but the betrayal of their work was a deeper wound. 2 days after he left, a check arrived via courier for $1 million. With it was the NDA. It was a document of total erasure. It stipulated that she could never claim to have worked for, contributed to, or been a part of Croft Innovations in any capacity. It stated that if she ever spoke of their personal or professional relationship, he would not only sue her for the $1 million back, but would countersue for damages to the company's reputation to the tune of $50 million. It was a gag order, a threat, and an insult all in one. He was buying her history, their history, for a fraction of what it was worth. She never cashed the check. For a year, she was paralyzed by the injustice. She watched from the sidelines as he was hailed as a lone genius, the next Steve Jobs. Every article that praised his innate coding talent felt like a knife twisting in her gut. He had stolen her work, her future, and her past. The wedding announcement was the final catalyst. Seeing his smug, triumphant face next to the perfect society princess lit a fire in her. This wasn't just his wedding. It was his coronation, a celebration of the very lie that had destroyed her. And she decided with a clarity that felt like destiny that she would not allow it to happen. "It's not about winning him back, Ben," she said, her voice low and steady as she finally turned from the window. "I wouldn't take him back if he were the last man on earth. It's about truth. He gets to stand in that white church and be celebrated as a self-made man. I'm here to remind him and everyone else that he wasn't self-made. He was made by me, and I'm the bill that's finally coming due." Ben squeezed her hand one last time. "Okay, then let's go raise some hell." He got out and opened her door. As Ava stepped out of the SUV, the ivory silk of her dress pooling for a moment on the asphalt, she felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She was no longer a victim. She was a reckoning, and she was about to walk into her own wedding. Inside the chapel, the air was thick with ceremonial reverence. The minister, a man with a soothing, practiced cadence, was speaking of unions, partnerships, and the sacred journey of 2 souls. Julian stood facing Charlotte, holding her delicate hands in his. He was so close. The words "I do" were forming on his lips. He gazed into Charlotte's blue eyes, a perfect reflection of the future he'd designed. "And do you, Julian Croft, take Charlotte Van Doren to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health for richer or for poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Julian drew a breath. This was it, the final seal on his new life. Boom. The sound was not loud, but it was definitive. It was the sound of the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel, being pushed open with force, swinging inward until they banged against the stone walls. Every head in the room swiveled in unison. The string quartet faltered, a single violin screeching into the sudden cavernous silence. And there, framed in the archway, like a spectre at the feast, stood Ava Reynolds. She was a column of pure white against the darkness of the vestibule. Her simple dress, her unbound hair, her lack of a veil. It was a statement of raw, unadorned presence. She wasn't an imitation of the bride at the altar. She was an alternative, a question made flesh. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. It was a sound of shock, of confusion, and for a few in the know of delicious, unadulterated scandal. Phones previously tucked away emerged as if by magic. The professional photographers, momentarily stunned, recovered quickly, their flashes beginning to strobe like frantic heartbeats, capturing the tableau that would be on the cover of every tabloid. By morning, the groom frozen in horror, the bride, her perfect smile collapsing into a mask of disbelief, and the woman at the door, the other bride. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. It was a nightmare. A living, breathing, silk-clad nightmare. Gabriel had failed. The 5-mile radius that disguises the threats, it had all been for nothing. She was here. Charlotte's hands went cold in his. Her head turned slowly from Ava back to him, her eyes wide with a dawning, humiliating horror. "Julian," she whispered the name, a fragile question mark. "Who is that?" But Julian didn't answer. His entire focus was on Ava, who had taken a single deliberate step into the chapel. His shock was rapidly curdling into a white-hot rage. How dare she? How dare she try to ruin this, the most important day of his life? Victoria Van Doren's reaction was faster. With a barely perceptible flick of her wrist, she signaled to the 2 broad-shouldered men in dark suits who had been standing discreetly against the wall. They were her personal security, and they began moving towards Ava instantly, their steps silent and predatory. They were halfway down the aisle when Ava's voice rang out clear and steady, without a trace of hysteria. It cut through the shocked whispers like a shard of glass. "Stop!" To everyone's astonishment, the security men actually paused. Her command was absolute. She took another step forward. Her eyes were not on the guards or the stunned guests, or even on Charlotte. They were locked on Julian. It was a gaze that held 3 years of shared history, of love and betrayal and simmering injustice. "Before you have me thrown out, Julian," she said, her voice resonating in the chapel's perfect acoustics, "perhaps you should explain to your bride and to her family what this is." Her hand came up, and in it she held a single folded document. It was a simple piece of paper, but she held it like a weapon, or a shield. The security guards looked from her to Julian, then to Victoria, awaiting confirmation to proceed. The entire room held its breath. The minister stood with his mouth agape, his prepared words about love and fidelity dissolving into irrelevance. Julian stared at the paper in her hand, and a new, colder fear washed over him, extinguishing the fire of his rage. He didn't know for certain what it was, but he had a sick, sinking feeling. An NDA could be explained away. A lover's quarrel could be dismissed as drama. But a document was proof. "What is this spectacle?" Victoria Van Doren's voice was low and lethal as she rose from her seat. "Remove her, now." But Ava didn't flinch. She just kept her eyes on Julian, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "Go on, Julian. Tell them. Tell them all who I am." The challenge hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He was trapped. In front of him stood the perfect future. Behind him stood the undeniable truth. And he knew in that gut-wrenching moment that he could no longer have both. The document in Ava's hand trembled, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor. Yet to Julian it seemed to shake the very foundations of the chapel. The world narrowed to that single piece of paper. The scent of the peonies was suddenly cloying, suffocating. The holy light from the stained glass windows felt like an interrogation lamp. His mind, usually a fortress of cold logic and forward planning, became a frantic cyclone of disastrous outcomes. He saw the gleeful headlines, the plunging stock ticker, the smirks on the faces of his rivals. He saw the Van Doren name, his golden ticket, turning to ash. He had to regain control. He opened his mouth, prepared to unleash a torrent of dismissive lies, to paint her as an obsessed, hysterical stalker. But the words that came out were a pathetic squeak. "It's nothing." He managed his voice, a hoarse croak that betrayed his panic. He waved a dismissive hand, a gesture that was supposed to look casual, but was jerky and unconvincing. He turned to Charlotte, forcing his face into a mask of pained sincerity. "Darling, I am so deeply sorry. She's a disgruntled ex. This is a pathetic, desperate stunt for money. Let's just have her removed so we can continue our day." Charlotte, however, was no longer looking at him. Her brief, wounded fawn expression had vanished, replaced by the chillingly focused calm of a predator assessing a threat. The Van Doren instinct for survival, honed over generations of navigating social and financial minefields, was now fully engaged. This was no longer just a romantic humiliation. It had the distinct metallic scent of a business complication. "What is the document, Miss Reynolds?" Charlotte asked. Her voice, unlike Julian's, was perfectly steady, cutting through the chapel's tense silence. She didn't look at Julian for permission. She had taken command. Ava's eyes flickered from Julian to Charlotte, and for a fleeting moment, a glimmer of something unreadable pity perhaps, or a strange sort of female solidarity passed between them. Then it was gone, replaced by cold resolve. "Why don't you ask your fiancé?" she said, her voice ringing with clarity. "He should recognize it. It's the original Articles of Incorporation for Croft Innovations." She let the words hang in the air for a pregnant, devastating beat, her gaze sweeping over the front pews before landing back on Julian. She delivered the final killing blow. "The company he founded. With me." A tidal wave of murmurs and gasps swept through the pews. Co-founder. The word was a poison dart. Julian saw it strike Marcus Thorne, the hedge fund titan whose eyes narrowed in instant cold calculation. He saw it hit Victoria Van Doren like a physical blow, her regal posture stiffening as the full implication, the one catastrophic possibility her team of lawyers and investigators had missed, slammed into her. This wasn't just a skeleton in the closet. This was a structural flaw in the foundation of the entire deal. "That's a lie!" Julian shouted, his voice finally finding its volume, but cracking with desperation. "A pathetic, baseless lie. Her name is on nothing. She signed an NDA. The mention of the NDA, meant to be a show of force, was a catastrophic mistake. It was an admission that there was something to be silenced, something worth paying for. Victoria's eyes flashed with fury at his stupidity, and then the second, more intimate and far more lethal betrayal of the day. "She's not lying, Julian." The voice was quiet, heavy with a sorrow that made it all the more damning. It came from beside him. It was Damien, his own brother, his best man. Julian whipped his head around, a silent, desperate plea in his eyes. But Damien refused to meet his gaze. Instead, his younger brother looked out at the stunned crowd, his face a miserable portrait of guilt and resolve. "I was there," Damien said, his voice gaining strength as he unburdened his conscience. I was a notary back then, trying to make extra money. I notarized the original partnership agreement in their apartment on Orchard Street. Before the venture capital funding, before the lawyers got involved. Before you pushed her out and rewrote the history. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes, glistening with tears, found Ava at the back of the chapel. We all know Ava built this company with you. If Ava's entrance was a bomb, Damien's confession was the dirty radioactive fallout that contaminated everything. Julian stared at his brother, the world tilting on its axis. The betrayal was so absolute, so inconceivable that for a moment he couldn't even feel rage, only a dizzying sense of disbelief. His own blood. The scene finally shattered its fragile container of social decorum and descended into open chaos. The photographers, sensing the story of a lifetime, surged forward like a single organism, their flashes strobing relentlessly. Guests were on their feet, not just whispering, but talking openly, their voices a rising tide of scandalized chatter. The minister, looking utterly lost, had backed away from the altar as if it were cursed. But the real explosion, the one that would level Julian completely, was yet to come. It came not from the ghost at the door, nor the traitor at his side, but from the bride. Charlotte grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging into the fine wool of his tuxedo like talons. She yanked him violently to the side behind a large marble pillar, creating a tiny private pocket in the public maelstrom. Her face, moments before a mask of pale shock, was now transformed into a canvas of cold reptilian fury. "You idiot!" she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper that was more terrifying than any shout he had ever heard. "You breathtaking, incompetent, utter idiot!" Julian was reeling his mind, unable to process the speed of his own destruction. "Charlotte, listen to me. I can fix this. I can fix this." She let out a short, incredulous, mirthless laugh. "Fix this with what more lies? More sloppy, half-baked cover-ups?" She leaned in closer, her breath hot against his cheek, her blue eyes like chips of ice. "Did you really think we were that stupid? That my family, the Van Dorens, wouldn't do a background check so deep it would make the CIA blush? We have a whole firm on retainer for this, for vetting new money liabilities, exactly like you." Her words were rapid-fire bullets. "We knew about Ava Reynolds. We knew she was the Orchard Street project. We wrote her off as a manageable risk, a bitter college girlfriend you paid off with $1 million. Pathetic but contained. My mother sat you down in the library 3 weeks ago. She looked you in the eye and asked, 'Julian, are there any other documents? Any other inconvenient partnerships from your past that might emerge?' And you smiled that smug smile of yours, and you lied directly to her face. You didn't just lie to your bride, you fool. You lied to Victoria Van Doren. You have absolutely no comprehension of the catastrophic mistake you have just made." Julian felt a cold dread, slick and oily, creep up his spine. This wasn't the wounded cry of a heartbroken lover. This was the furious post-mortem of a CEO whose merger has just spectacularly imploded due to undisclosed liabilities. "I don't understand," he stammered, the words feeling thick and stupid in his mouth. "Of course you don't," she sneered, her lip curling in disgust. "You never did. You were so busy buying your way into our world, you never bothered to understand how it actually works. You saw us as a prize, a name, a beautiful backdrop for your pathetic Horatio Alger story. You never once stopped to ask why. Why we were so eager to welcome a tech billionaire with no family, no history, no pedigree into the fold. She delivered the truth with the brutal efficiency of a guillotine. "My family is broke, Julian," she said, each word a perfectly enunciated shard of glass. "Not poor darling, never that, but broke, leveraged to the hilt on bad real estate deals and my father's disastrous belief in oil futures. One more bad quarter, one more creditor calling in a note, and the whole house of cards comes down. We didn't need your love. We didn't need your charisma. We needed your company. We needed Croft Innovations, a clean, scandal-free, cash-positive asset with a meteoric stock price. It was our life raft." She gestured vaguely towards the chaos in the chapel. "And you, with your secret co-founder and your notarized partnership agreements, have just riddled that life raft with holes. A foundational legal claim to the intellectual property. A public scandal that will send the stock into the toilet before the markets even open on Monday. You haven't just embarrassed me. You have financially ruined us." She took a step back, her assessment complete. Her eyes raked over him one last time with a look of such profound contempt it physically hurt him. "You're not a visionary. You're not a genius. You're a bad investment. You are in every sense of the word completely and utterly worthless." The word hung in the air between them. Worthless. The primal fear he had spent his entire life running from the label he thought his billions had made him immune to was now his final official designation. He looked from Charlotte's face contorted with a rage born of financial desperation to her mother Victoria, who was now standing with her lawyer, her expression not one of anger, but of cool, pragmatic damage control. He looked past them to Ava standing quietly at the back of the chapel, her expression not triumphant, but somber, watching the collapse of the world they had once built together. And in that horrifying, crystallizing moment, Julian Croft finally understood. He wasn't the predator in this gilded jungle. He wasn't the clever hunter who had trapped the perfect prize. He was the prey. He was the golden goose they had lured into their pen, and he had just confessed to his buyers that his eggs were made of lead. He had been played outmaneuvered and utterly, totally vanquished. Charlotte's final hissed word, worthless, was the gunshot that started the race. A race for everyone to distance themselves from Julian Croft as quickly and publicly as possible. The victor by a landslide was Victoria Van Doren. With the calculated poise of a CEO announcing a hostile takeover, she rose from her pew and glided to the front of the chapel. She didn't hurry. Her movements were deliberate, designed to draw every eye. She ignored the minister, who now looked like a bewildered bystander at a multi-car pile-up, and positioned herself at the center of the altar, reclaiming the stage. The murmuring chaos subsided as she prepared to speak. Her voice, when it came, was not raised, but it carried the chilling authority of old money and absolute power. "To our esteemed friends, our family, our honored guests," she began, her gaze sweeping across the assembled titans of industry and society mavens. She subtly acknowledged Marcus Thorne, the powerful hedge fund manager in the third row, whose fund held a significant stake in Croft Innovations. "You have borne witness today to a most unfortunate and disillusioning event." She paused, letting the drama hang in the air. "The Van Doren family entered into this proposed union in good faith. We believed Mr. Croft to be a man of vision, yes, but also a man of integrity. We believed his narrative of singular, self-made success. It has become painfully, publicly clear that this narrative is a fiction, a deception." She turned her head slowly, her ice-blue eyes pinning Julian to the spot. "We have been presented today with evidence corroborated by Mr. Croft's own brother that his success was not his alone. that the very foundation of his company, the value upon which this union was predicated, is built upon a lie of omission, and it would seem the blatant theft of intellectual property. A fresh wave of gasps and frantic whispers rippled through the pews. Victoria had just handed every investor, every journalist, the exact legal terminology they needed. She had weaponized the scandal for them. "This union," she announced, her voice dropping to a lethally calm register, "is hereby terminated. The Van Doren family will not under any circumstances be proceeding with this marriage." She held up a hand to silence the burst of camera flashes. "Furthermore, let me be unequivocal. We will be filing a lawsuit against Mr. Croft for fraudulent misrepresentation and breach of the nuptial contract. We entered into this arrangement under the assumption of his sole ownership of a company whose valuation is now a matter of serious legal jeopardy. He has not only humiliated my daughter and betrayed our trust, he has attempted to defraud my family. We will see him in court, and we will pursue this matter to the fullest extent of the law." It was a public execution delivered with the serene smile of a surgeon. In 2 minutes, she had completely rewritten the narrative. The Van Dorens were no longer desperate socialites clinging to a tech billionaire. They were the shrewd, aggrieved victims of a contemptible fraud. She had insulated her family and delivered Julian's head on a silver platter. With a final withering look that communicated utter revulsion, she turned, took Charlotte's arm, and began her regal, unhurried retreat down the aisle. Charlotte, for her part, played the role of the shattered bride beautifully. Her head bowed her Vera Wang veil, now a shroud of tragic dignity. Their departure broke the spell. The social fabric of the room tore apart. The guests, understanding the verdict had been delivered, began a mass exodus. It wasn't a panicked rush. It was a controlled, almost chilling stampede of the elite. No one made eye contact with Julian. He was radioactive, a social leper. A senator he'd golfed with last month hurried past, suddenly fascinated by his shoes. The wife of a tech CEO, who had gushed about his genius at a dinner party, literally turned her back as he looked her way, creating a physical wall of silk and disdain. The exodus was a sea of averted gazes and frantic whispers, 1,000 tiny knives of social shunning. He was left standing alone at an altar, built for a future that had just been firebombed. The opulent arrangements of peonies and hydrangeas, once symbols of his triumphant arrival, now seemed like funeral wreaths on the grave of his ambition. The only person who approached him was Damien. His brother's face was a wreck of conflicting emotions: guilt, fear, and a stubborn sliver of righteousness. "Julian, I had to." Damien started, his voice barely a whisper. "I couldn't let you. You've home," Julian snarled, spinning to face him. The word was low, guttural, packed with a lifetime of fraternal rivalry, now curdled into pure hatred. "You sanctimonious little worm. You stood there, my best man, and you gutted me." "It was the truth," Damien shot back, finding a sliver of courage. Don't you remember? Don't you remember those nights on Orchard Street when you were sick with the flu and she stayed up for 48 hours straight, rewriting that entire algorithm from scratch because you said it wasn't elegant enough? Do you remember her crying when you finally got that first seed money? Not because of the money, but because she said, "We did it, Jules. We really did it." The memory so long suppressed lanced through Julian's fury. He did remember. He remembered the smell of cheap coffee and her hair as she fell asleep on his shoulder, the keyboard still warm. The memory made his betrayal feel even viler, and his rage surged to cover the shame. "You think you're a hero?" Julian laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You just destroyed your own family for a woman who hasn't been part of our lives for years. You are dead to me. Do you understand? Get out of my sight before I do something we'll both regret." Damien flinched as if struck. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a grey, hollow look of defeat. He opened his mouth to say something more, then closed it. There was nothing left to say. He turned and walked away, not down the main aisle, but through a small side door, disappearing like a coward. Julian was now truly alone. Except for her. He turned his gaze to the back of the chapel. Ava hadn't moved. The chaos had swirled around her, but she had remained a fixed point of stillness, the calm eye of the hurricane she had created. The document was a crumpled mess in her hand. Her shoulders were no longer squared with righteous fury. They were slumped with the profound, soul-deep exhaustion of a soldier who has won a war only to find the battlefield silent and empty. There was no look of triumph on her face, no gloating smirk. There was only a vast, hollow sadness. He felt an insane urge to rage at her, to blame her for all of this. He took a step down the aisle toward her. "Are you happy now?" he called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "You got what you wanted. You ruined me." Ava finally looked at him, and her gaze traveled over the opulent, empty room, the wilting flowers, the abandoned programs littering the pews. Her eyes, when they met his, were filled not with hatred, but with a weary, devastating pity. "Look at all this, Julian," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying clearly in the stillness. "Look at this grotesque theater you built. Did you really think this was winning?" She shook her head slowly. "Nobody won here today. I just came to collect on a debt. The bill is paid. That's all." She let the crumpled document fall from her fingers. It fluttered to the stone floor, a forgotten casualty of the war. With that, she turned. For a moment, Julian thought she might say something else, offer one last word of damnation or farewell. But she didn't. She simply walked out of the massive oak doors and into the sunlight. Her simple white dress, a stark final rebuke to the Vera Wang-clad lie he had tried to build. She didn't look back. The moment she was gone, the silence was broken by a roar. The paparazzi held at bay until now surged past the overwhelmed security, their cameras flashing like a violent electrical storm. The noise was deafening, the questions shouted and incoherent. Julian felt a hand on his arm. It was Gavriel, his face grim. "Sir, we have to go. Now." Julian allowed himself to be pulled away, stumbling like a drunk. The flashes were blinding, each one feeling like a physical blow. He wasn't the brilliant tech mogul. He wasn't the society groom. He was just a story, a cautionary tale. The man who tried to buy a legacy and erase a history, only to lose everything in a single spectacular self-inflicted blast. He was worthless. And in the blinding glare of his public ruin, he knew with chilling certainty that it was the only true thing anyone would ever say about him again. The hours following Ava's departure were a blur of exquisite humiliation. Julian remained rooted to the spot at the altar, a statue in a Tom Ford tomb, long after the last guest had fled. The flashes from the paparazzi outside the chapel doors were relentless, their ghostly light painting the stained glass windows in strobing infernal patterns. He felt like an animal in a zoo, his public caging complete. His security head. Gavriel finally materialized, his face a grim mask of failure. "Sir, we need to move you." Julian didn't respond. He was listening to the sound of his future being dismantled, one whispered phone call and one frantic news alert at a time. The hashtag #WeddingGate was already trending. The ride back to Manhattan was silent. Gavriel drove his eyes fixed on the road, the air in the car thick with unspoken recriminations. Julian's phone, which he'd left with his security team, was a vibrating brick of incoming notifications. He scrolled through them with numb fingers. Hundreds of missed calls. His lawyer, his PR chief, every single member of the Croft Innovations board, and a single brutal text from his brother. "I'm sorry. It was the right thing to do." Julian hurled the phone against the divider, where it shattered into a spiderweb of black glass. He spent that first night in his penthouse, a glass palace overlooking a city that now scorned him. He prowled its empty, cavernous rooms, a tumbler of scotch in his hand, watching his own immolation on every news channel. There was the footage Ava ethereal and damning in her white dress. Charlotte, her face a perfect mask of aristocratic fury. Victoria Van Doren, delivering her lethal proclamation. And him. Julian Croft, the self-made billionaire, looking small, trapped, and utterly defeated. The commentators were sharks in a feeding frenzy, tearing apart his reputation with glee, framing the story as a modern-day Icarus tale. He wasn't just a liar. He was a cliché. The business collapse was even swifter and more brutal than the social one. When the stock market opened at 9:30 a.m. on Monday, Croft Innovations CRFT was in free fall. Julian watched the ticker on a financial news network, the red arrow pointing down like a spear aimed at his heart. Billions of his net worth evaporated in minutes. The emergency board meeting was convened via video call that afternoon. It was a bloodbath. The members, men and women who had praised his genius and cashed his checks for years, now looked at him with cold contempt. Led by a hedge fund manager named Marcus Thorne, a man Julian had once considered a friend, they invoked a morals clause in his contract. "Your actions constitute gross misconduct and have caused irreparable reputational damage to this company." Thorne said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "We are asking for your immediate resignation as CEO and chairman of the board." "You can't do this," Julian snarled, the scotch making him reckless. "I am this company." "No, Julian," Thorne replied coolly. "You're a liability. The board vote is unanimous. Your access will be terminated by the end of the day." The screen went blank. He was locked out of his own kingdom. The Van Doren lawsuit landed the next day. It was a work of legal savagery, a 50-page document detailing charges of fraud, intentional misrepresentation, and emotional distress. Their lawyers, a famously ruthless firm, leaked select damaging excerpts to the press, ensuring the narrative of Julian as a manipulative monster was cemented in the public consciousness. The cruelest cut came a week later. He saw his brother Damien on a morning news show. Looking tired but resolute, Damien gave a quiet, heartfelt interview, publicly apologizing to Ava Reynolds for his complicity and his silence. He explained how Julian's ambition had curdled into a corrosive greed that he could no longer stand by and witness. He announced he was leaving his position at Croft Innovations and taking a job with a legal aid society. Julian watched, shaking with a rage so profound it felt like a physical illness. His own family had publicly chosen her side. The betrayal was absolute. The following months were a descent into a grey, featureless hell. Julian became a prisoner in his own home, the sprawling penthouse a gilded cage. He fired his household staff, unable to bear their pitying glances. He let the floor-to-ceiling windows gather a film of city grime, keeping the blinds drawn, living in a perpetual twilight. Paranoia became his only companion. He was convinced his phone was bugged, that every car parked across the street was a surveillance van. He spent his days obsessively scrolling through articles about his downfall, rereading the vicious comments, torturing himself with the evidence of his global disgrace. He saw photos of Charlotte in St. Bart's, laughing on a yacht with a handsome German duke, her trauma apparently assuaged by Mediterranean sun and new money. She had successfully rebranded herself as the resilient survivor. Meanwhile, a different story was taking shape across the East River. After the wedding, Ava had been hounded by the press. For 2 weeks, she was painted as the vengeful woman scorned, a narrative she found almost as suffocating as Julian's initial erasure. But she and Ben hunkered down, ignored the noise, and focused on the work. Using the notarized partnership agreement Damien had confessed to, and bolstered by Damien's public apology, Ava had leverage. She didn't want to sue for a piece of the dying Croft Innovations. She wanted a clean break. She wanted to build something new. She took a meeting with Athena Ventures, a female-led VC firm known for backing overlooked female founders. She didn't lead with the scandal. She led with the code. For 2 hours, she walked them through a new, more elegant and efficient logistics algorithm she had been developing in secret for the past year. It made the core technology of Croft Innovations look antiquated. The firm's lead partner, a sharp woman named Sarah Jenkins, listened intently. At the end of the presentation, she leaned back. "The technology is brilliant, Ms. Reynolds, but the world knows you as the woman who crashed a wedding. Why should we invest in that?" Ava met her sis without flinching. "You shouldn't invest in the woman who crashed a wedding. You should invest in the woman who built the company that wedding was supposed to celebrate. The woman who was so ruthlessly effective that Julian Croft had to pay millions to silence her. I didn't crash a wedding to get revenge. I did it to get my name back. Now I want to put that name on a company that values integrity as much as innovation." She got the funding that afternoon. She called her new company Axis for the way it would become the new center of the industry. Her first hire was Ben. Her second was a young engineer she'd mentored years ago. She built her office in a bright, airy loft in Brooklyn, fostering a collaborative culture that was the antithesis of Julian's top-down, fear-driven regime. The Wired article titled "The Phoenix of Silicon Alley" was her public coronation. It told the full story, painting her not as a victim or a villain, but as a brilliant technologist who had reclaimed her power. The accompanying photo showed her at a whiteboard marker in hand, surrounded by her diverse, smiling team. She looked purposeful. She looked free. Reading that article was the final nail in the coffin of Julian's ego. He realized with a soul-crushing certainty that her rebellion had never truly been about him. Destroying him was just a necessary step in her process of creation. He was a footnote in her comeback story. This realization sparked a desperate final impulse. He needed to see her. He needed some form of closure, of absolution, of anything other than this suffocating indifference. He showered for the first time in days, put on a clean suit that hung loosely on his frame, and took a car to Brooklyn. When he walked into the bright, buzzing offices of Axis, it felt like stepping onto another planet. People were talking, laughing, collaborating. Ben Carter spotted him instantly, his friendly face hardening as he moved to intercept. "You have no right to be here, Julian." But Ava had already looked up from the whiteboard she was working at. Surprise flickered across her face, followed by a merry resignation. She held up a hand to stop Ben, then nodded toward a small, glass-walled conference room. The silence inside was deafening. He looked at her truly, looked at her for the first time since that day in the chapel. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a calm, centered confidence. She was no longer the ghost of Orchard Street. She was the CEO of Axis. "I came to apologize," he began the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. "For everything. For stealing your work, for breaking your heart, for trying to erase you. I was so lost, so desperate to prove I was worthy that I became a monster." He looked down at his hands. "I'm sorry." Ava listened patiently, her expression unreadable. When he was finished, she asked a simple, devastating question. "Are you apologizing because of what you did, Julian, or because you got caught?" The question hung in the air, a perfect, polished mirror reflecting his own pathetic soul. He wanted to scream, to protest, to insist his remorse was genuine. He tried to summon the righteous indignation, but it wouldn't come. He saw the truth laid bare in her unwavering gaze. He was sorry because he had lost. He was sorry because his name was worthless. His penthouse was a prison, and his life was empty. His apology was the final selfish act of a drowning man begging for a raft. He had no answer for her. His silence was his confession. A slow, sad nod was her only reply. "I thought so," she said softly. "I wasted a year of my life hating you. Then I wasted a few months being afraid of you. I'm done wasting my time on you, Julian. That day at the wedding wasn't the end of my story. It was the end of my story with you. It was the only way I could get back to my own life, to my own work." She stood, signaling the end of the meeting and the end of them for good. "The thing is, I don't hate you anymore," she said, her voice clear and final, devoid of passion or malice. "To hate you would mean I still care. You're just a chapter I've finished, reading a bad investment I've finally written off. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a company to run." She turned and walked out of the conference room, without a backward glance, immediately rejoining her team at the whiteboard, her back to him. Julian remained in the glass box, a specimen on display. He watched her point at the board, her team nodding eagerly, the energy of creation palpable even through the soundproof glass. He was an outsider looking in at a world he had helped create, but could never be a part of. He had been utterly and completely erased, not by a legal document or a public scandal, but by something far more permanent, her complete and total indifference. He walked out of the vibrant office and back into the grey afternoon. He was Julian Croft, the man who had everything and nothing, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life, forever chained to the memory of a woman who had finally gloriously learned how to build a world without him. And so Julian Croft's gilded empire, built on a foundation of stolen ideas and profound betrayal, crumbled to dust. This wasn't just a story about a wedding gone wrong. It was a brutal lesson in consequences. It shows that the truth, no matter how deeply you bury it, has a way of clawing itself back into the light. Ava Reynolds didn't just crash a wedding. She reclaimed her life and her legacy, proving that true power isn't about the money you have, but the integrity you keep. Julian wanted to buy respectability, but he learned the hard way that it can only be earned. What would you have done in Ava's shoes? Would you have taken the money and stayed silent, or would you have risked it all for the truth? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love stories of dramatic justice and spectacular downfalls, please give this video a like, share it with a friend, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more true-life dramas.